At this point, we're going to allow the candidates to question each other. All right, and the same kind of rule will apply where, Carolyn, if you ask Dan a question, Dan gets a minute to answer, and then if you have a rebuttal to him, you'll have a minute to rebut him as well, and then we'll reverse the table. So Dan, you can ask a question, something you want to get to, all right?
Sure.
So Dan, why don't we start with you asking Carolyn, she'll answer, and then you'll have your shot.
Okay, so it's question, answer, rebuttal.
Correct.
Okay. Carolyn, we've talked an awful lot about how to fund public education, which we both agree is very important and ought to be a true priority of state government. We haven't talked about some of the more nitty-gritty issues facing public education in the state. And I was wondering, what is your position on the MCAS exam and on the notion that teachers ought to have, so there ought to be some measure of performance of teachers, and either salary incentives for higher performance or adverse reactions to lower performance?
Sure.
Okay.
Teacher performance and performance evaluation in education is what I heard from Dan. And again, I come from the private sector where absolutely you have to evaluate performance. That's the only way you're going to move ahead, is by knowing where you are and knowing where you need to go. I do support assessment. I have concerns about the way the current MCAS system is implemented. What I see, and I've got children in the public schools right now, I see the current situation focusing teachers on a single set of exams and spending a tremendous amount of time doing that, instead of looking at the long-term need for education, which is, you know, critical thinking, which is sort of an expanded creative curriculum that will allow our students of the future to have, you know, fill the creative jobs that are going to drive our economy forward. So I do think we need to rethink MCAS, rethink education continually to improve it and adapt to what we need for the future. Merit pay is something that you mentioned. I would like to see our teachers have some avenue to be recognized for exceptional performance.
Well, I'm not sure I heard whether you support MCAS. You probably know that recently Massachusetts was the first state ever to perform at the highest level in both math and English on the MCAS, on the standardized tests. My question actually stemmed from the fact that I'm aware that last week the Massachusetts Teachers Association paid for a mailing for you, and that's several $1,000s to do that. And I know from dealing with the Massachusetts Teachers Association that they are very strict about their criteria for endorsement. They are strongly against MCAS. They have put up roadblocks to teacher accountability. And so I would ask, in light of the positions you just stated, if you would be willing to share the questionnaire that you filled out for them to get their endorsement.
Well, I do have a questionnaire, and I certainly am willing to make that available. As a matter of fact, I think, you know, transparency in government is absolutely something that we need to do. And I would actually also ask you to identify those individuals on your campaign finance report who are registered lobbyists. Because I think, you know, you've made a comment about being an independent voice for this district, and I think that the voters need to understand how independent you'll be and whether, you know, where you're getting your financing, because you've raised a tremendous amount of money. And I think, again, to your point about transparency, let's open it up and be very clear about where our interests lie.
Absolutely. Actually, the Secretary of State website will tell you everyone on my list who's a lobbyist. There's not too many of them, but the point I would make is that any individual contribution in my fundraising report represents less than 1% of the total money I've raised. Those mailers that the Mass League of Environmental Voters have done for you, that the MTA have done for you, those are thousands of dollars, and I suspect that those represent a much larger percentage of the money that you've raised. And so if you're talking about, and these are groups that have very serious agendas and very strict criteria as to who they'll support and what they ask of who they support. And I've been there. They're very aggressive in enforcing that. And so, you know, if you think a $200 contribution representing less than 1% of all my contributions is going to win someone some sway over my thinking, I don't see the logic in that, and that's certainly not the case.
I think the important point that comes out of that exchange is that both people have agreed to be transparent.
Sure.
And ultimately the voters get to decide. Yeah. That's the whole idea.
Absolutely.
Here. All right. So Carolyn, you have the opportunity to come up with a question. Dan, you have a 1 minute, and then you, if you so desire, have a 1 minute
Sure.
rebuttal to that.
There was a report done by the Mass Taxpayers Foundation in light of this question 1 proposal, which you have said you would vote for, and I said I would vote against. And the numbers in Hopkinton show that local aid numbers will be reduced by approximately $1 million if question 1 passes on the ballot. So I would ask you to explain to the citizens of Hopkinton and the other towns who will see very real decreases in local aid numbers, just explain to them why that should be passed.
Well, Carolyn, I understand what you're doing here, and I understand it's useful for you to try and characterize me as some sort of irresponsible slash and burner. I have explained my position on question 1. I've done it standing next to you tonight. I've done it standing next to you in other forums. There is no evidence in our recent history to support the notion that the parade of horribles that opponents have identified will actually come marching down Main Street. Of course, I don't advocate for gutting municipal services. And of course, I don't want to defund education. Question 1, to me, I would never say to the people who have gathered the signatures to put that on the ballot that they wasted their time. I understand why they did it. They're fed up with the way our government spends its money. Our government took in $1 billion more than they budgeted for last year, spent that $1 billion, spent another $1 billion, leading directly to the mess we're in right now. And so the voters are speaking in the only way that they can in this system where the legislature does not respond to them. They're sticking it in their face. And in recent history, when the voters have done that, the legislature has smushed it right back.
I get a rebuttal, right? I guess, we can talk, and I assume this is sort of the sending the message again. We're sending a message with question 1. And as a resident of Holliston, the last time we heard language from you about sending a message was, to my recollection, the first time that you've been present on town meeting floor in Holliston. And it was a discussion about funding for education, and you said we need to send a message to the State House to not vote in favor of the local override, which was school-specific. And we in Holliston know the very real impacts of that message. And the impacts of that message were not a change in government. The impacts of that message were, at the time, $400 bus fees for every child on the bus, decreases in the number of teachers and aides in our schools, as well as we now pay for fees for sports in the middle school. So quite frankly, I think this whole message sending concept is not going to work for our communities. We need solutions, not messages.
Well, we need the voters' voices to be heard, and frankly, when I stood up, I didn't say send a message. I said we need to draw a line and stop letting the state shirk its responsibility to fund local aid by going back into our own pockets to make up the shortfall when they take in record revenues and don't send any of that back to the local level.
We can look back at the record, Dan. You said we need to send a message to the State House. We sent it. And we know what happened. It did not change government, did it? It cut services locally.
It certainly did. And as Joan Vanaki said in the Boston Globe last week, no conservative columnist, if we want to change government on Beacon Hill, we have to elect more Republicans, members of the minority party who have a different point of view than the people up there who treat us like an ATM.
I'm going to cut it right here.
I want a piece of this.